let's start with a very basic definition of a supply chain. What exactly is a supply chain? So a supply chain is, if you were to think of a chain, it's the different links in that it starts from the raw material, the very basic raw material, and it goes all the way to having the product in the hand of the customer, and then even talking about the disposal of that product after the customer has used it. So we're talking about the complete chain going from purchase of raw material to distribution of the product to the recycling or to the disposal of the product toward the end. Let's take a specific example of a supply chain for peanut butter. So peanut butter, if you think about it, where does it start? It starts with growing the peanuts. So the farmer needs to purchase seeds, fertilizer. They need to have irrigation, so they need irrigation services in order to get the water for growing the peanuts. Next, the peanuts are bought maybe by a wholesaler. They could be bought directly by the company that's going to make the peanut butter. So it could be many different ways in which a peanut butter manufacturer might purchase those peanuts, either directly or through a wholesaler. So what is happening if there's a wholesaler is there's one more tier being added to that supply chain, one more link being added to that supply chain, if you think about it that way. The peanut butter manufacturer has their own facilities. They may outsource some of it. They may do everything themselves in terms of the crushing of the peanuts to making the peanut butter all by themselves. And then they send it out for sales. The sales, again, could be direct sales. The company could be selling peanut butter to you as a customer through a online selling source, or they could be selling through a retail channel. They could also be selling it through a channel like a wholesaler that is going to purchase from them and then going to sell to retailers. So there may be some consolidation there, another link, another tier being added there. And finally, you could have bulk purchases of the peanuts in terms of the catering facilities that companies have or universities have that use the peanut butter in the products that they make for you. So if you think about this particular supply chain, we're talking about from a farm to a fork, getting it from the fields to the fork on your table. That would be the complete supply chain for peanut butter. Right. Now that we have a definition of supply chain and we've seen what that means, let's see why this topic has become so important in the past 4 or 5 decades. So there are two aspects to this, why the complexity has increased. One is the complexity in the demand and why that has increased in the last 4 or 5 decades. So customers today, if you think about buying things for yourself, you have a lot of choices of buying any product. You can buy it from all over the world pretty much. You don't have to worry about it coming from the country in which you're living in. Companies are able to sell across borders. Countries have relaxed any kind of restrictions on material being passed from one place to the other, and so the market is very global. There are multiple distribution channels. You can walk into a store and try something, or you can buy it online. You can you can get the benefit of user reports when you're buying something, and you can base it on that. So you don't really even have to go to a store to experience something. You can rely on other people's experience with that product in order to make that purchase. The life cycle of products has become much shorter. So what is happening is with the increasing pace of change in technology, products are being renovated every day. You're getting new products every day. You're getting newer types of cell phones, newer types of tablet computers, and that is changing much more quickly. So in terms of the complexity of demand for a company's product, companies find it very hard to even forecast what's going to cannibalize what products demand, and so on and so forth. If you think about these three areas are impacted by the changes that have happened in the next point that we're talking about here, which is information systems has a much bigger impact. The internet has a much bigger impact, and nowadays the use of big data in terms of being able to forecast what is needed by customers has a huge impact on how customers sell products to you. So what you can see is these three aspects are making managing demand much more complex for any company, for any supply chain for that purpose. Looking at it from the other side, and it's going to be similar from a supply side in some sense, because the three things that we talked about, the internet and data analytics and information systems are having an impact on the supply side as well. So in that sense, there are some opportunities that companies have in terms of sourcing from suppliers. So there's been an increase in outsourcing simply because companies are able to keep better tabs on their suppliers. They can take what would have been a risky purchasing decision in the past is no longer risky because they can have a tighter control over their suppliers in some sense, because they can share real-time information and they can see what's going on, and they can be flexible if there's any kind of an issue with the supply chain. There's a rise in global outsourcing for the same reason. So if you think about outsourcing has increased, but offshoring has also increased. And again, it's because of things like the internet and having information systems that can keep track of your suppliers, that offshoring has increased. Of course, the time that it takes for material to get delivered over shipping lines has not decreased that much, but that's something that companies have to still deal with. Complex networks in the sense that companies are buying and selling to the same company. So, for example, Apple computers or Apple iPhones could be used in cars, in airplanes. They could be having some kind of an alliance with a car manufacturer or an airline manufacturer. And I'll put it on the opposite side. Apple might get into making cars themselves, so they might have a buy-sell relationship with the same company. So in that sense, the complexity of the network has become much higher. The pace of change has changed from a customer's perspective, but from a producer's perspective, they have to keep an eye on technology. What is getting obsolete? Things that are changing really quickly have an impact. Nokia is a company that we no longer talk about because they were the ones that failed to keep up with the smartphone technology. So that's where it makes a difference in terms of complexity of the supply chain and how companies have to incorporate that in making their decisions, in making their long-term decisions. And finally, companies today are talking about their triple bottom line. Customers are asking companies, customers are demanding that companies report on their triple bottom line. What does that mean? Companies not only have to worry about financial performance, they also have to think about the impact that their operations are having socially and environmentally. So where are they buying their raw material from? What are the conditions in the countries from where they're buying their raw material from? Is having a meaningful impact on how they can sell their product. Similarly, in terms of the environment, what are they doing in terms of the waste and disposing of the waste that is coming from their facilities is something that customers are paying much more attention to. So in that sense, it's adding a lot more that companies have to think about when they think about, we're going to source this from a particular supplier in a particular country, and what is that going to mean for not only our financial performance, but in terms of what are we going to be able to tell our customers as to where their product is coming from. So let's talk about managing a supply chain after we've got a definition of supply chains now. So managing a supply chain, if you were to think about it, it's the idea that you want to grow the size of the pie for the whole supply chain. You want to make the supply chain such that you get higher profits for the whole supply chain so that everyone can share. Everyone in the supply chain, all the companies in the supply chain can share in that profit. But coming down to a more formal definition, managing a supply chain is about managing the flows of goods and services, but it's also about managing the flows of associated information and financial transactions. So what does that mean? When we talked about supply chains, we talked about simply the goods going from raw materials and being distributed and going to the customer. And then we talked about the disposal of the product. But if you think about it more closely, there's also information that is involved here. What do we mean by that? Information in the sense of day-to-day, what are the changes in the orders that have to be made, what is the customer demand and how is it changing. And you also have to think about it from a long-term perspective in terms of when companies are developing new products, how do they share information in terms of developing the new products. Finally, with financial transactions, how is the increase in that pie, if we can call it that, the increase in the total profit of the supply chain, how is that going to get shared across the different partners in that supply chain is something that supply chain management discusses, talks about. So in that sense, supply chain management is a much larger topic. We can talk about many of these different aspects of a supply chain from not just managing the flow of goods and services, but also managing, for example, the intellectual property rights, also managing, for example, how the patent protection is in different countries from where things are being sourced. And those things also have an impact on supply chain management, as well as how are companies going to have contracts that take the benefits of the supply chain and pass it to each of the players. The performance of a supply chain is going to get determined by how good it is matching the demand and supply. So the idea being that you have product when it's needed, where it's needed, and in the quantities that it's needed, and the quality that it's needed. So we're talking about matching demand and supply from a very basic perspective. So when we talk about supply chain management, one of the most fundamental decisions that is involved in supply chain management is this decision that companies have to make. Should we make something ourselves, or should we buy it from outside? So it's the make or buy decision. And the make or buy decision could be about many different types of activities that the company might be involved in. So you have the core activities of a company. So if you're talking about a cell phone manufacturer, R&D for manufacturing that cell phone is a core activity. The assembly of the cell phones is a core activity, and the marketing, if it's a branded cell phone, is a core activity. And companies have to think about whether they're going to outsource any of these activities. Now, it was unheard of that companies would outsource R&D, but given our current developments in information technology, that has become a possibility. So companies are doing that. And of course, companies can outsource their marketing and their assembly. So a lot of companies are doing that. When you talk about outsourcing, you could be thinking about the supporting activities. So it's not just whatever the core activity of that company is, but it could be, for example, their payroll maintenance. It could be their logistics, their distribution, even distribution of within their own plants. If they have an assembly plant in a different part of the country and they have a finishing plant in a different part of the country, they might even outsource their logistics. So you have third-party logistics that are taking care of the logistics aspects of it. And then you have the information systems maintenance being outsourced to the experts in doing that. You could be thinking about outsourcing in terms of a way of entering a global market. So if you want to get into if you are a US company wanting to get into the car market in India or in China or in Vietnam, you might outsource in the sense that you might partner with somebody who's already there and use that in terms of making products for that market. So you are outsourcing because you want the production to be closer to consumption in that sense. Now let's take a look, let's unpeel the onion of outsourcing a little more and see why do companies outsource. So at a very basic level, at a very, in a very traditional sense, why did companies outsource? Why did they used to outsource? And it was basically because you wanted to access something that a supplier is able to do better than you are, right? So you're getting access to some kind of specialized knowledge. If you're talking about distribution, you are going to a UPS or a FedEx because they know how to do these things. They do it on a day-to-day basis. You may be outsourcing. One of the reasons for outsourcing could also be volume. You simply don't have the volume. If you are a car manufacturer, you make many different types of cars. Only a few of those or a small percentage of the cars may need a particular component. Let's take, for example, a sunroof, and you don't have enough volume to make to make that sunroof yourself. So you say, I'm just going to purchase it from somebody who's making this in larger volumes and has a cost advantage based on that. It could be because of you want to keep your company size small. You want to keep it manageable. You don't want to have a large company to manage. So because of that, you might outsource the activities that you could. So those are the reasons that companies typically outsource. Of course, when you talk about outsourcing from that sense, from the conventional sense, there were the typical risks of outsourcing. One of the easiest ones that you can think of is you become dependent on the company that you outsource to. If the manufacturing plant or the manufacturing facility of that company has to shut down because of a strike, because of if you're offshoring to that country, because of there's political disturbance in that country, that might shut down. Your dependence on that particular manufacturing plant or the country as a supplier is going to cause trouble for you as a manufacturer. You are scared, you are going to be aware of not wanting to outsource your core activities, right? So if you're a car manufacturer and you're thinking about the engine, that's a core activity, and if there's some proprietary technology that has got to do with that particular aspect of your product, like the engine of the car, you'll say, well, I don't want to lose that core activity. I don't want to give it to somebody because it might get copied. Also, I want to keep it in-house because that's something that I want to learn more about and develop more. So I want to keep that core activity in-house and not outsource it. And something that we can all relate to in terms of what if I give the production of this to a supplier, what about the quality? Are they going to pay as much attention as I, as a company would, as my company would, to the quality of that component? And that's something that you think about from an outsourcing perspective, whether the supplier is going to pay that much attention to the quality of the product that they're selling to you. So there's this framework that has existed for some time now that you can apply in order to make an outsourcing decision. So if you think about it, it's a 2x2 matrix. On the left side, on the x-axis, we have asset specificity. On the y-axis, we have asset specificity, and on the x-axis, we have uncertainty. So going on the vertical is asset specificity, and on the horizontal is uncertainty. So if you think about what is asset specificity, first of all. So asset specificity is a level of dependency that can be there. So what do we mean by that? In order to make a particular product for you, if a supplier has to set up something that's very specific to you as a buyer, it's called asset specific. So they have to build assets to be able to supply that product to you. There is a high degree of asset specificity then. So it should be very logical that when there is a high level of asset specificity, you should be thinking about making that in-house. Because why should a supplier put up a manufacturing plant specifically for you if that particular technology is specific for you? You can think about it another way. When there's a high degree of asset specificity, there's not going to be much that the supplier is going to gain in terms of volumes, because they're only making it for you in a specific way. So if you think about asset specificity being high, you're already being pushed towards making something in-house. On the other extreme, if you think about asset specificity being low, it's easy to think of, well, then you should outsource. If it's something that is very generic that the supplier has to make for you, and probably that supplier is making it for other buyers as well. For example, tires for ordinary cars, right? For economy cars. Tires for economy cars are something that no car manufacturing company would make themselves. They would be willing to outsource them and get them manufactured from tire manufacturers. So when you think of low asset specificity, the decision then goes towards outsourcing. If you think of this as a 2x2 matrix, on the x-axis having uncertainty, so when you have a low asset specificity and low uncertainty, the decision is to outsource. On the other extreme, when you have high uncertainty, high asset specificity, the decision should be to make in-house. The question then arises, what about the other two boxes on this 2 by 2? So low uncertainty, high asset specificity. There you could be either making it in-house, or you could be outsourcing it, but because there's going to be a high degree of asset specificity, you want good intellectual property protection, you want strong contracts in order to protect the interests of the buyer so that they don't get copied. Also, you want to protect the interests of the supplier, because if they're setting up something that is going to be specific to this particular buyer, they want to be able to make sure that they keep getting the orders that justify the setting up of those assets. Now, the empty box that we have in this 2 by 2 is high uncertainty and low asset specificity. So what happens when there's high uncertainty? What happens when companies are dealing with technology that they don't know whether it's going to last long or whether it's going to become obsolete? Well, what happens there is that when you think of as uncertainty goes up, you are tempted as a buyer to outsource things. You don't want to set it up yourself, and if possible, you want to find somebody who is able to make that product for you. But if the uncertainty keeps going up to an extreme, what would happen is, why would buyers be willing to set up those manufacturing facilities for you? And as the uncertainty goes to an extreme on the high side, you wouldn't be able to find buyers. So you would be forced to making it in-house. So it's not very clear what decision you would make if it was high uncertainty and low asset specificity. But this is a useful framework that gets used a lot when you're thinking about making outsourcing decisions, when you're thinking about making your basic make or buy decisions. Let's take a look at another, a more simplified framework. So it's getting a little less theoretical here, and this is coming from manufacturing strategy. So this is a framework that has been applied more to manufacturing companies. And here you have the 3 decision criteria: coordination, strategic control, and intellectual property. And if coordination is going to be hard, so if coordination is going to be hard because the kind of knowledge that needs to be shared between buyer and supplier, if the buyer cannot specify, codify what they need from the supplier, then the obvious decision there is going to be you make the product yourself. You're not going to be able to specify things to the supplier, so you make the product yourself. On the other hand, if you can codify what is needed, if the knowledge is codified or codifiable, then you are going to say, well, let's just send the drawings to the supplier and they can make it for us. Similarly, if the task, if it's a component that can be easily separated from all the other things that are going into making a particular product, if that's easily separable, then you're going to buy, if it's going to be a distinct task that's needed. Versus if it is a component that's not easily separable, that is very intrinsic to your product, then you're going to rely on making it. If there's learning by doing, if we have to work towards how this component is going to fit into your product, then you are going to tend towards making it yourself, or you should tend towards making it yourself. Control, the second criteria. This should be something that is intuitive, because if you want control and it's something that you want to keep control yourself, you would make it yourself. So if there are unique production assets and there's unique research and development that's involved, you want to make the product yourself. On the other hand, if it's common, if it's a technology that is going to get used by many different buyers of that same product, then there's going to be somebody else out there who can do it better than you, so you're going to outsource that. You're going to buy that from that outsourced company. Intellectual property, we talked about this earlier a little bit, and if intellectual property can be easily protected, then you're going to tend towards buying something. But if intellectual property, if the boundaries are not very clear, and it's not very clear as to how you can protect your intellectual property, or if you're buying from a particular country that does not have very good protections for intellectual property, you might tend toward making it yourself. So those are some practical ways for thinking about a make or buy decision. These are the different criteria that you should think about. We talked about buying and making as two different extremes of a continuum. But if you think about it, nowadays what companies are doing is that they are moving toward the middle of this continuum. And I call this supply partnerships because it's partnering with a buyer, or thinking about it from a different perspective. It's something that you would do on your own, that you would give to a buyer, and you probably would have some kind of information exchange, some kind of partnership, active partnership, so that you can get the benefits of both. So if you think about it, what we're saying here is you're trying to get the benefits of that specialized knowledge of the supplier, but at the same time, you're saying, well, there might be some things that we can do better together. Or there might be control that I don't want to lose, and therefore I'm getting into this partnership. I'm putting in an effort to get into this partnership. Now, partnerships can also be on a continuum. It could be simply that you have a contract for what quantity that company has to sell to you and what quantity you are committing to purchase. Or it could be, on the other extreme, a supplier alliance. It could be an alliance with one supplier in saying that we commit to not only buying this product from you, but also to developing new products by working with you. So that could also be on one end of the continuum or other when you're talking about a supply chain partnership or a supply partnership. In fact, when you think of a company like Apple, you rarely think of the company doing well because of its supply chain. You probably think of Apple doing well because of its innovation, because of the new products that it comes up with. But in fact, Apple owes a lot of its success to managing partnerships with suppliers and managing inventories. Tim Cook, who took charge of the supply chain in 1998, came in and made a big change to their supply chain. In fact, he's known for saying that you treat your supply chain for making cell phones like a dairy. If it's going beyond its use-by date, you're in trouble. So he used to always talk about it from that point of view, and he did a lot of things in order to help the turnaround at Apple. He did a lot of things to manage its supply chain better, to manage its inventories better, and which got Apple back on the trajectory to growth and doing much better as it has continued. All right, let's take a pause here and think about two companies that you may know of, that you may have heard of, and just guess, think about what kind of outsourcing do they do. So Toyota is one company. So think about what kind of outsourcing does Toyota do? What percentage of their trucks and cars are outsourced? And second, what I'd like you to think about Boeing's Dreamliner project, and what percentage of that particular airplane, when they were developing that airplane, was outsourced, and what was outsourced outside the US. So two different questions here. So here are the answers to those two questions. Toyota outsources approximately 70% of its cars and trucks. So they assemble the cars and trucks based on assemblies, sub-assemblies that they get from different suppliers. And what is different about Toyota outsourcing 70% is, even then, within the US, if you look at cars that are manufactured in the US, if you look at the top 10 cars manufactured in the US, their cars, 5 of those cars out of those 10 cars are Toyotas, which means what? They outsource, but they outsource to local suppliers. They outsource from local suppliers and get their materials from them. On the other hand, if you look at Boeing and their Dreamliner project, their Dreamliner 787 was offshored, so it was outsourced outside the US to the extent of 35%. Now, this may not mean much to you other than the previous project, the 747, was outsourced to the extent of only 5%, so 5% to 35%. And if you put these things together, you're seeing that outsourcing and offshoring are two completely different things, right? So outsourcing could be to local suppliers, and it doesn't necessarily mean that you're outsourcing outside the country. Offshoring means that you're getting from distant places. The other thing that you might want to note about these two companies is Toyota has had some trouble in the recent years because that can be traced to quality problems from some of its outsourced parts. And in the case of Boeing's 787, this has been talked about a lot. There were a lot of delays in that project, and some of that was blamed on offshoring their part supplies and not keeping track of their suppliers, and that was blamed for the delay of the project. So it tells you about some of the risks of outsourcing, some of the risks of outsourcing that you can manage if you're managing your supply chain better. So in closing, what I'd like you to take away from this is that there's not going to be a one-size-fits-all kind of a solution when you talk about supply chain management. It's a complex problem. You have to think about many things. But here's another way of thinking about it, another way of thinking about supply chain decisions. And the idea of this particular matrix here that we have, again a 2x2, is talking about aligning the objectives of the supply chain. So aligning the objectives among the different partners that are in a supply chain. So here on the 2x2, we have supply uncertainty and demand uncertainty. On the left side, supply uncertainty if it's low, and demand uncertainty if it's low. So you're talking about products like groceries. You want to focus on a supply chain that's more efficient. You're focusing on cost reduction. You're focusing on getting products that can be made at a much cheaper cost. Going down on the supply uncertainty axis, going down to high uncertainty, there you're focusing on hedging your risks. If there's high uncertainty, you're talking about building safety stock. You're talking about having multiple suppliers. What if one supplier has to close down? Do we have a second supplier from whom we can source? So you're talking about hedging your risks in whatever way you can. You could be using inventory tactics like pooling the inventory for different areas in one place and being able to manage it better in that way. Let's move on to the other side of demand uncertainty. So if there's high demand uncertainty and there's low supply uncertainty, you should be looking for a responsive supply chain, a supply chain that relies on suppliers that may be co-located, right? So you're talking about fashion goods. You want your suppliers to be co-located so you can respond quickly to any changing demand. You could be thinking about mass customization techniques, making some products make to order and then making some products make to stock, so you're able to be responsive to your customers when you get different orders from them. And finally, if you're in a situation where the demand uncertainty is high and the supply uncertainty is high, you need to do a little bit of everything, right? You need to have a responsive supply chain, which means you have to have mass customization techniques. You need to have co-located suppliers. But then if you're talking about co-located suppliers, you may be trading off the risk. If they're located right next to you, and if there's an environmental disaster in that area, then everything is going down. So in terms of risk hedging, you have to rely on other things. But when you're talking about high demand uncertainty and high supply uncertainty, you have what is called the agile supply chain, which is both responsive and at the same time trying to hedge against risks of any problems that might occur. So that is a basic overview of what supply chain management is all about.